Now, AstraZeneca has suspended trials of the coronavirus vaccine that were undertaken with the University of Oxford, or Oxford University. Now, the trial was suspended after one of the volunteers in the United Kingdom fell ill with what is called an unexplainable condition. The trial was paused to allow for a review of safety data by an independent committee. South Africa and Brazil joined the UK clinical trials in June. Joining us now is Professor Helen Rees, the South African research lead on solidarity clinical trials for COVID-19 treatment regimen. Good to have you with us this afternoon, Prof. And not very good news, though, regarding this current trial, and perhaps more importantly, regarding this volunteer who's fallen ill. Now, all that we know is that it's an unexplained illness. What were the symptoms of this illness?
So, in fact, we don't know that, and there's a good reason for that. But with any large clinical trial, remember that there are thousands and thousands of people who've already been enrolled. 17,000 people have volunteered for the different phases of this particular trial for this vaccine, the Oxford vaccine. And when you enroll large numbers of people, you do expect that along the way you're going to get some people who will get sick. And the important thing is to identify should that happen, but then also to work out whether that's got anything to do with the vaccine or if it's just purely coincidence. Because when you have 17,000 people, it'll be up to 30,000 people for this vaccine and for other vaccines. Somebody somewhere along the line is likely to get sick, and you have to be able to differentiate whether it's caused by the vaccine or just a coincidence.
I wonder, Professor, in an instance where somebody does get sick while they're under a vaccine trial of this nature, or the worst case scenario, an individual dies, what type of recourse does that individual's family or the individual themselves, if they're still alive, have as far as the trial is concerned?
Well, it depends, as I say, whether this is anything to do, whether it's causally associated with the vaccine or not. So when you set up a trial like this, before you even start, you mentioned at the beginning that there's an independent committee. That independent committee is set up right at the beginning of the study, not just because something happens. And they're looking all the time independently. They're not part of the research team. And they look all the time at safety and the conduct of the trial. So they're able to give an independent view and a review, and the regulatory authority similarly will be looking at this to say, is it cause or is it not? And should it be that anything was causally associated, then there is insurance that does protect patients, or participants rather.
And what are the health standards of vaccines? We do know that obviously nothing is ever foolproof, but what are the safety precautions that are put in place? How safe are they?
No, to do any vaccine trial or any trial of any new drug, in fact, we're extremely strict globally about this. And you've probably heard people talk about phase 1 trials, phase 2 and phase 3. Phase 1 is a small study when we first look at safety and dosages and whether it looks like this product might or might not work. And then you go to a slightly bigger study where you're looking again at safety first. And then you're saying, and does it look like this vaccine in this case, is it immunogenic? Does it create the sort of response we want to see in the body in terms of immune response? And then you go to these big phase 3 trials, which is going on now for the Oxford trial. And then you have tens of thousands of people, and you're saying, is this vaccine safe? Does it work? Is it actually going to protect? But the safety standards are huge. Each country that participates, that the trial has to be approved by the local regulatory authority, in this case SAPRA, and the local ethics committees. And there's an independent body, as I say, that looks all the time at safety and the conduct of the trial and makes recommendations to the research team. So the standards are really very, very high, and they have to be. They really have to be for something as important as a vaccine.
In a situation like this, where an individual has been found to have had an adverse effect, an individual who's actually been on the clinical trial, where to now? We see that AstraZeneca has withdrawn from the trial. Is this a temporary cessation, or are they just going to continue after a while? What happens now?
So this is temporary while they do the investigation. This is not going to be well. It'll depend on what they decide. If they think that there's any causality between what has been seen in terms of this person's symptoms, which we don't know about formally from the research team, then they will take a different view. But if it's thought that this has nothing to do with the vaccine, unfortunately, when you've got thousands of people in trials, things will happen. And that's why you have to be able to have an independent review. Then the trial will resume. These trials are extraordinarily important for the world, but they have to be conducted with the greatest of safety and diligence. And that's what we're seeing now. And then probably we will know about resumption in literally probably a few days. And I'm sure they're looking at this case and looking at whether they think there's any causality with the vaccine or not, whether there's an association with the vaccine or not.
Now, Professor, you're part of the WHO committee. How far are we as far as other trials are concerned and the progress that is being made in other parts of the world regarding this?
It's been an extraordinarily accelerated process to try and develop a vaccine, because ultimately to stop this virus coming back repeatedly and having shutdowns and openings, we'll need a vaccine. This is what the world believes. So we've gone very fast and very far. So we've got 7 candidate vaccines now in clinical trials, and 4 of which are in these very advanced stages of clinical trials, and 150 to 200 vaccines that are likely to come through to clinical trials sometime in the future. So we are moving very rapidly, much more rapidly than we've ever done for any vaccine before. But we're trying to make sure that in doing that, we're not cutting any corners. The safety has to be paramount, and proving that this vaccine clinically works is also incredibly important.
There was a bit of controversy a little bit earlier on with Russia coming out saying that they have a vaccine. Where are we as far as those developments with Russia and their vaccine?
So the Russian research team have published some of their findings on these early phase of the study, and it shows that the vaccine appeared safe and created an immune response, which is what we look for in those early stages. So there in Russia and in a couple of other countries, they're now going into this much larger phase study. But I think from a regulatory point of view, I think most regulatory authorities, certainly in South Africa, would want to see a lot more data. They only had 76 participants so far in the early stage studies. You need, as we're seeing, literally tens of thousands of participants enrolled to see whether the vaccine works and whether it's safe once you get into a much larger population. So more work's being done, and those studies have started in Russia and elsewhere.
Professor, if you could just comment on this. We are also hearing of countries where those who've already had COVID-19, their plasma being harvested and then injected into others to see if that perhaps might act as some sort of a vaccine due to the antibody production that would have taken place in those who already had contracted the virus. What is your view on that stance and that particular procedure and process?
So this is another approach, especially when you've got a new virus that we've got with COVID-19. So you get convalescent plasma, as you said, and you get the antibodies, and you see whether giving the antibodies to people with the disease, and obviously these would be people who are at the moment seriously ill in hospital, whether that has an impact. So there are studies that are also ongoing looking at what's called convalescent plasma and looking at whether these antibodies will assist, because it's a different way of boosting the body's own immune system to fight COVID-19.
And how far are we really from a vaccine? Are there any projections as to which month, what year will we possibly have some sort of vaccine on the market?
Well, it's the million-dollar question. I think that many of us think it would be extraordinarily optimistic to think that there was vaccine on any scale available this year. I think that we are all hoping that next year, in 2021, possibly by the middle of the year, there will be a vaccine that's successful. That's the first thing that we have to have, at least one vaccine, and that we have to have sufficient commercial product that allows us to distribute this globally. So the other thing that is getting a lot of attention is not only are we going to be able to have enough manufactured so that it would be available globally, but also there's an enormous global debate going on to ensure that poorer countries, middle-income countries such as South Africa, also are able to negotiate a share of any vaccine that does come through the system.
Well, thank you so much for your time as well as your input and insight this afternoon, Professor. That's Professor Helen Rees there, as we talk about the suspension of a vaccine trial. AstraZeneca has withdrawn from that trial. It's the one that's being done by Oxford University. But as the professor has said, they're just pausing for now and will look at the circumstances surrounding the one volunteer who had adverse effects and may decide to continue with that trial. So not completely aborted as things stand.